My name is Sarah. These days, I work alongside my husband, John, at his family's small company run by his father, Richard. The company is tight-knit, with only 6 employees, and Richard mostly lets us handle things. John, who is set to take over as president, works tirelessly. He's always on the lookout for new clients and projects, constantly striving to help the company grow. When there's a big project, everyone pitches in, and the office becomes this lively, energetic place filled with excitement. I've been here for 10 years, ever since I married John. One day, I came home early to cook dinner, expecting to find John relaxing after a long day at work. But he wasn't home yet. To my surprise, it was my mother-in-law, Nancy, who greeted me. She used to work at the company, but since John and I married, she'd retired, and I noticed something wasn't quite right. She seemed bothered. She looked at me sharply and asked, "Sarah, how long do you plan to stick around the family business?" Her words hit me like a cold wave. What did she mean by that? Confused, I asked her to clarify, but her implication was clear. She thought I only married John because I couldn't find a job elsewhere, and now I was just leeching off the family business. The frustration bubbled up in me. I explained that I had chosen to work here, that it was my decision, but she didn't believe me. She seemed to know everything about me, or at least, she thought she did. Without listening, she walked away, leaving me feeling small and misunderstood. But it wasn't just her words that bothered me. It was the way she treated me, especially when it came to housework. After she retired, my father-in-law, Richard, asked her to help with household chores since she was home all day. But Nancy refused. "I've worked all my life," she'd say. "Now it's the daughter-in-law's turn." So, guess who ended up cleaning the kitchen every day? That's right, me. I'd come back from running errands, and there it was, a pile of dirty dishes waiting for me. It was exhausting, frustrating, and frankly, a little unfair. One afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I approached her. "Nancy," I said hesitantly, "I've noticed the dishes are often left in the sink. It would really help if you could clean up after your meals. It's just a small request, but it would mean a lot to me." Her reaction was swift, but not at all what I expected. Her eyes flashed with anger, and she snapped, "Are you trying to give me orders in my own house? You're just a daughter-in-law. How dare you dictate what I should do?" Her words stung, each one digging deeper, reminding me just how fragile the balance in our family was. And then, she said it, those words that cut through me like a knife, "I wish Jessica were here instead of you. She's far more considerate and understanding than you could ever be." Jessica! My sister-in-law. The one who had missed our wedding because of a hangover but was now making a name for herself in Manhattan. Fashion design. Ambitious, spirited, and always in control. Despite the lack of time we spent together, I couldn't help but admire her. But even mentioning Jessica seemed to worsen the situation. Nancy couldn't stand the thought of Jessica being in Manhattan, though. She saw it as cold, impersonal, just not a place for someone as warm-hearted as Jessica. Then, as if the tension in the room wasn't thick enough, she turned her attention to me. After all, I was from Manhattan too, and in her eyes, that explained everything. My supposed aloof manner toward her was the final straw. I could feel my frustration bubbling over, but despite everything, I still had dinner to prepare. If I didn't start soon, we'd be eating much later than usual. "Mom," I said, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart, "let's continue this conversation later. I need to focus on getting dinner ready, or we'll be eating quite late tonight." Reluctantly, Nancy retreated to the living room, leaving me with my thoughts. The clattering of cooking utensils filled the space, but my mind was in turmoil. Richard and John knew about Nancy's treatment toward me, and though they tried to intervene, it seemed nothing ever changed. Every time they confronted her, she turned the blame back on me, becoming even more hostile. Her usually kind face twisted with disdain, and her words were sharper than before. I had never been subjected to physical violence, but the emotional toll was another matter. Their support, Richard and John's support, was my solace. But it didn't make the sting of Nancy's words any less painful. Then, one morning, something unimaginable happened. After I'd finished cleaning up from breakfast, I was preparing to leave for work when Nancy suddenly, without warning, exclaimed, "Oh my! What a mess they made here!" Before I could even process what was happening, she poured a bucket of water over my handbag. My heart stopped. Shock and anger paralyzed me for a moment. "What are you doing, Nancy?" I stammered, my voice trembling with disbelief. Nancy's response was casual, almost playful, like a mischievous child. "Oh, was that your stuff?" "I thought it was just a big piece of trash," she said, her voice laced with a flippant tone. I couldn't believe it. Even if she thought it was trash, who pours water on it? And now my carpet was soaked. I couldn't even think straight, the frustration overwhelming me. "What about the vacuum cleaner?" I demanded, my words jumbled in my anger. I frantically emptied the contents of my soaked bag, documents I needed for work spilling onto the table. Her response was cold and matter-of-fact, "Because you don't need to go to work anymore." Confusion and disbelief flooded through me. I sat down across from her in the living room, the morning light casting an eerie glow on her face. She seemed resolute, like she had made a decision that would change everything. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice heavy with confusion. Her words pierced me, sharp and deliberate. "You've been clinging to this house for 10 years, but finally, I can get rid of you." I was stunned, my heart sinking. "Get rid of me?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. How could she say that? How could she think that? Her words made me feel like I was nothing more than an outsider in this family. The moment my mother-in-law's words sank in, I felt the floor fall out from under me. "My daughter is joining the company, so we need you to leave." "Today's your last day," she said, her voice laced with cruel mockery. Her laughter echoed in my ears, a twisted reminder that I had been nothing but a pawn in her eyes. How could she? I had poured my heart into this company, dedicating 10 years of my life to it. And yet, here she was, asking me to leave, just like that. All those years of sacrifice, building trust, nurturing relationships, and creating memories, discarded as if they never mattered. I was left speechless, the injustice of it all overwhelming me. I couldn't help but ask, my voice shaking, "Are you sure about this? Wasn't Jessica working in a clothing store in Manhattan? Wasn't she the one who, despite being ambitious, had grown tired of the fast-paced city life? She had made her choice, and now she was back, seeking refuge in the family she had once abandoned. Was I really being replaced by her? The weight of that realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Nancy continued, almost gleefully, "I have a job ready for her." She agreed to come back immediately. And there it was, the final blow. My place in this family, in this company, was suddenly erased. She handed me a resignation letter, as if I were nothing more than a piece of paper, something to be tossed aside. The sting of that gesture cut deeper than I could ever have imagined. I left the house, my feet heavy as I made the short walk to the office. What was I even walking toward anymore? The morning air felt colder than usual, the world moving in slow motion around me. As I entered the office, I shared the painful truth with John and Richard, expecting sympathy, but instead, I saw only a mix of shock and frustration in their eyes. They remained calm, almost too calm, suggesting that perhaps it was time for me to step down, to let Jessica take over and face the consequences of her actions. Their words, meant to comfort, only deepened my confusion. I had worked so hard, so tirelessly, for the family business, and now I was being told to leave. What was my future now? I had no idea what it was like to take a real vacation, to live without the constant pressure of work. But as I packed my bags, John and Richard gently encouraged me to take a break, to find my own path. Could I really do that? Could I walk away from everything I had known? I embarked on my trip, each step taking me farther from the life I once thought I had. As I traveled, I reflected on everything, the choices I had made, the life I had built, and the future I now faced. Meanwhile, Jessica, the woman who had replaced me, didn't even bother to show up until late afternoon. She sauntered in at 1 p.m., showing no interest in learning the ropes of the company. How could she think this would be easy? John and Richard were left to hold everything together, their frustration palpable. I couldn't help but worry about the future of the company. Was this really what it had come to? On my 4th day of peace, as I enjoyed some local delicacies, my phone rang. It was Jessica, crying. Mom said it was an easy job, just sitting in a chair, but John and Dad are acting like I can't do anything right, she sobbed, her words filled with helplessness and frustration. Was she really blaming them for her own incompetence? I took a deep breath before asking, "So, Jessica, how proficient are you with computers?" Her response revealed how little she knew about the tools needed for the job. How could she take over my role when she didn't even know how to handle basic tasks? From managing sales data to editing images or handling customer information, she was clueless. But when I asked if she could calculate taxes or fill in documents, she grew unsure, her confidence faltering. This was a wake-up call. She wasn't ready for this responsibility. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my composure, knowing I had to do something about this situation. "If you're taking over my job," I said firmly, "I expect you to handle accounting, to know how to write professional emails, and to manage the staff schedule with care. No more acting like a friend to everyone, you're in charge now." As I listed my demands, I could hear her crying in the background. Her emotional breakdown only fueled my resolve. She wasn't ready for this. 3 days later, I returned home to a scene that only added to the madness. Nancy, her face flushed with rage, confronted me the moment I walked through the door. "You! How dare you make my daughter cry?" she shouted, her anger explosive and misguided. But John and Richard stepped in, trying to calm her down. Could she not see how unreasonable she was being? "Jessica is crying because she was scolded for trying to boss around employees without knowing what she's doing," John explained, his voice firm yet calm. But Nancy wouldn't hear it. "This woman is the reason Jessica is suffering," she retorted, pointing her finger at me with venom in her voice. As the argument raged on, I couldn't help but notice Jessica's absence. Where was she? She wasn't there to defend herself, nor was she there to face the consequences of her actions. It only deepened the mystery of what was really going on behind closed doors. The atmosphere in the house had shifted dramatically, and it felt like the calm before an impending storm. "Jessica's locked herself in her room," John explained, his voice heavy with concern. "She's been crying and saying she doesn't want to go to work anymore." I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sympathy and frustration. Jessica, who had so casually stepped into my shoes, seemed utterly overwhelmed by the responsibilities she had assumed. It was no surprise. How could she handle it when she had no idea what she was doing? Then came Nancy's accusation, sharp and cutting. "You've been poisoning John and Richard against me, haven't you? If not, they wouldn't say the company ran better with me than with the incompetent Jessica." Her words hit me like a slap to the face, laced with years of misunderstandings and grudges I hadn't realized were festering. How could she have such a low opinion of me, after everything I had done? John sighed deeply, his expression worn, like a man who had fought too many battles. "Mom, I know it might sound odd coming from me, but Sarah is truly exceptional at her work," he began, trying to reason with her. "She has a certification in bookkeeping, her secretarial skills are top-notch, and she speaks Spanish. She's the one who handles everything when it comes to dealing with multiple languages at our company." His voice was filled with pride, yet Nancy's face was one of stunned disbelief. She had always assumed I was just a newcomer who had abandoned everything for the sake of joining the family. She had no idea about the years of dedication I had poured into the business. It seemed like Nancy needed to hear more than just facts. I shared a bit about my past, about the days when I was immersed in my studies, focused solely on certifications, barely finding time for anything else, including romance. It was during that time that I met John, ironically, during a business meeting at my company. But before I could delve further into the personal history, I steered the conversation back to the present. "I was entrusted with a lot of responsibility at the company," I continued. From accounting to scheduling, liaising with other companies, managing employee shifts, it was a lot, but I did it because I believed in our family's future. John added, his tone matter of fact. The work environment became much more comfortable compared to the times when you were around, Mom. That seemed to stun her into silence for a moment. But the real shock came from Richard, John's father, whose words cut through the tension. We're going to shut down the company soon, he said, his voice calm but carrying an unsettling finality. Jessica made a huge blunder. She was asked to prepare some documents, but she decided it was more fun to handle phone calls. She ended up being rude to the person in charge of Company A. I was in shock. How could Jessica have been so careless? The thought of our company crumbling because of her incompetence was terrifying. As the conversation unfolded, Richard and John made a suggestion that seemed almost too good to be true. It might be time to consider the company being absorbed by a larger one, Richard said, his voice thoughtful. The prospect of securing a steady customer base through this absorption seemed like a glimmer of hope in what had otherwise been a chaotic and uncertain time. But just as quickly as this hope blossomed, Nancy shot it down. That's not acceptable, she declared vehemently. John must become the president. This company is ours. I was taken aback. Was it really about securing the future of the business, or was Nancy just desperate to maintain the title of being the president's wife? Her refusal to entertain any new ideas, any change, was suffocating. The conflict reached its peak when Jessica, having been hidden away in her room, finally emerged into the fray. Her confusion and shock were palpable as she listened to her parents argue, her own place in the family now uncertain. Wait a minute, Dad, she stammered, her voice rising. Mom might be a lost cause, but I'm your precious daughter, right? The family dynamics were disintegrating before our eyes. How had it all gotten so tangled? Richard's patience snapped. You're part of this too, Jessica. You came home because you couldn't make it in Manhattan, and now you can't find a job, but still, you act all high and mighty? His words were harsh, and Jessica's trembling form only confirmed the magnitude of the situation. Richard wasn't done. It's time for you to leave this house, he said, his voice cold but resolute. The reality of our fractured family began to sink in. The calm facade had shattered, revealing the truth of their dysfunction. As Nancy began to pack her things, John and I stood in stunned silence, trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening. But Richard wasn't finished. I'm divorcing you, Nancy, he said bluntly, placing the divorce papers and a photo of Nancy with a young man on the table. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. If you sign the papers now and leave, I won't demand alimony. I know it would be futile anyway. His words hit Nancy hard. She had spent years investing in the wrong things, her image, her relationships outside the family, while neglecting the home she was supposed to care for. The family upheaval continued, with Jessica now caught in the crossfire. You came home because you couldn't cut it in Manhattan, Richard spat, and now you're trying to act like you belong here? It's time for you to go. Jessica resisted, of course, but it was clear she no longer had a place here. You're betraying Mom now? Nancy shrieked, her face twisted in disbelief. It wasn't long before Richard took the final step. I've asked an acquaintance to take you in, he announced, his decision final. They're running a factory with dormitories. You'll be working there. With no other option, Nancy and Jessica began packing their things, preparing to leave the house and the life they had known. As they left, John, Richard, and I were left to pick up the pieces. We had been through so much, deception, betrayal, and heartache, but the future now seemed a little brighter. The family business, though shaken, was about to be absorbed by a larger company. And amidst the chaos, I had discovered I was pregnant, a tiny light in an otherwise dark period. As I shared the news with the president of Company A, he was delighted, assuring me that someone would replace me, easing my worries. With John and Richard now working harder than ever, everything seemed to be falling into place. For the first time in a long while, I felt hope. A new chapter was beginning, one that was ours to